The body was found face down in 6 inches of water, 47 miles from where Thomas Hendricks had last been seen alive. That detail alone would have been strange enough to warrant investigation, but what the search party discovered when they turned Hendricks over made even the most hardened mountain men take a step back. His eyes were open, frozen in an expression that suggested he'd seen something in his final moments, something that defied explanation. His rifle lay 10 yards upstream, wedged between rocks, the barrel pointed back toward where he'd apparently been standing. His powder horn was bone dry, carefully kept out of the water even as he died. His knife remained sheathed at his belt, unused, suggesting he'd never had time to draw it, or never thought he needed to. But it was the bruising that made the trappers exchange uneasy glances. Dark purple marks encircled his neck and shoulders, not in a pattern that matched any animal attack they'd ever seen. The marks looked almost like handprints, if hands could be that large, that strong, and positioned at angles that didn't match human anatomy. Whatever had gripped Thomas Hendricks had held him with enough force to leave marks that had turned nearly black in the cold water. The creek at that location was barely ankle deep. A child could have stood in that water without risk of drowning. Yet Thomas Hendricks, a powerful man who'd survived 3 Rocky Mountain winters, who'd fought off a grizzly bear attack in the spring of 1835, who could swim like an otter and move through rough country like he was born to it, had died there, drowned in water so shallow it barely covered his back. These are the moments we love to explore here at Old West Archives, the moments when the frontier became truly inexplicable, when experienced men died in ways that challenged everything we understand about survival and danger. If stories like this captivate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover the mysteries that haunted the American wilderness. And tell us in the comments, what's your favorite piece of frontier history that still lacks a clear explanation? Now, about Thomas Hendricks, let's find out what happened to him and how he ended up that way in the river. Samuel Yates, the trapper who found him, would later tell anyone who'd listen that the worst part wasn't the body itself, it was the location. Hendricks had been checking trap lines along Black Canyon Creek's middle section when he disappeared. The spot where Yates found him was 15 miles downstream, in a section of drainage that Hendricks had no reason to visit, no cause to travel through. To reach that location from his last known position would have required traveling through some of the roughest canyon country in Wyoming territory. Vertical rock faces, churning rapids, sections of creek where the walls closed in so tight a man could touch both sides simultaneously. No one could explain how Hendricks had made that journey. More troubling, no one could explain why he'd made it. His trapline was upstream, his camp was upstream. Everything that mattered to his survival was behind him, not ahead. Yet somehow, in the time between leaving camp on a clear September morning and being found 4 days later, Thomas Hendricks had traveled 15 miles through impossible terrain and drowned in water too shallow to kill a man who was conscious and able to fight. The search party spent hours at the location, trying to understand what they were seeing. They measured the water depth repeatedly, as if the numbers might change. They examined every inch of Hendricks' body, looking for wounds that would explain his death. They found none. No bullet holes, no knife wounds, no broken bones, no signs of bear or mountain lion attack. Just those impossible bruises and lungs full of creek water. One of the trappers, a man named Dutch Henry who'd been working the Rockies since 1827, knelt beside the body and ran his fingers along the edge of the bruising. His face had gone pale beneath his beard. "I've seen men die every way you can think of out here," he said quietly. "Bear attacks, arrows, knife fights, falls, freezing, drowning, gunshots, disease. But I ain't never seen marks like these. And I ain't never seen a man drown in 6 inches of water, unless someone held him under. But there's no tracks, no signs of a fight. Nothing but him and this damned creek." They buried Thomas Hendricks on a ridge above Black Canyon Creek, where the aspens grew thick and you could see for miles in every direction. They marked the grave with stones and said what prayers they knew. Then they gathered their gear, mounted their horses, and left that drainage as fast as their animals could carry them. None of them spoke during the ride back to Fort Bridger. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like madness. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Thomas Hendricks was just the beginning. In the next 6 months, Black Canyon Creek would claim 2 more experienced trappers in circumstances so bizarre that the fur companies would eventually declare the entire drainage off limits. Men who'd faced down grizzlies without flinching would refuse to work those 43 miles of creek, even for premium prices on prime beaver pelts. Something was wrong with Black Canyon Creek. Whether it was geology, hydrology, toxic gases, or something that defied natural explanation entirely, 3 men would die there before the trapping community abandoned the drainage completely. And decades later, geologists studying the area would discover conditions so unusual, so perfectly calibrated to kill in ways that seemed impossible, that they'd struggle to believe such a place could exist. Now, to understand what was happening on Black Canyon Creek, and why some of the most capable men in the Rocky Mountains would eventually refuse to set foot near that water, we need to understand geography, the pattern of deaths that would unfold, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes nature creates conditions so perfectly lethal they seem like deliberate traps. Black Canyon Creek cut through the western Wyoming territory like a wound that wouldn't heal. The drainage covered roughly 200 square miles of terrain so unforgiving that even Native American groups who'd lived in the region for thousands of years approached it with caution, bordering on reverence. The creek itself ran approximately 43 miles from its headwaters near Granite Peak, a jagged spire of volcanic rock that scraped the sky at over 11,000 feet, down to where it emptied into the Green River in a valley that seemed peaceful compared to the violence of the canyon above. But those 43 miles contained more ways to die than any comparable stretch of water in the Rocky Mountain West. The creek's name came from the dark, volcanic rock that lined much of the upper drainage, creating gorges so deep and shadowed that sunlight only touched the creek bed for a few hours each day. But the name carried weight beyond simple description. By 1837, trappers would whisper that the black in Black Canyon Creek referred to something darker than geology, something about the place itself that swallowed men and gave nothing back but bodies and questions. The numbers told part of the story. The creek originated at nearly 11,000 feet and descended to roughly 4,000 feet at its confluence with the Green River. That meant over 7,000 feet of elevation loss compressed into those 43 miles, an average gradient of over 160 feet per mile. For context, most mountain creeks considered dangerous have gradients around 50 to 80 feet per mile. Black Canyon Creek's gradient was 2 to 3 times steeper than what experienced trappers typically worked. That extreme descent meant water moved through Black Canyon Creek with violence. Even during low water conditions in late summer, The current could knock a man off his feet. During spring runoff, or after summer thunderstorms, the creek became a churning avalanche of water, rocks, and broken trees that could tear a horse apart. But the gradient alone didn't make Black Canyon Creek unique. The Rockies were full of steep, fast-moving creeks. What made this drainage different, what made it lethal in ways that defied normal understanding, was the combination of factors that existed nowhere else in quite the same configuration. The geology was the first piece of the puzzle, though nobody understood its significance until after men had died. The creek bed was primarily limestone and volcanic rock, both laid down in ancient geological epochs when this entire region sat beneath a vast inland sea. The limestone was riddled with voids and passages where water had dissolved the rock over millions of years, creating what geologists would later call karst topography, a landscape where the surface was just the visible portion of a complex underground drainage system. Beneath the creek bed, water flowed through chambers and tunnels that connected in patterns nobody fully mapped. Some of these passages were large enough to drive a wagon through. Others were narrow slots where water shot through under tremendous pressure. The passages connected to the surface through vertical shafts, solution pipes, that formed when acidic groundwater dissolved limestone along natural fracture lines. These shafts ranged from 2 feet to over 6 feet in diameter, and their depth varied from shallow pits to vertical drops exceeding 200 feet. The critical detail that would cost lives: most of these shafts were invisible from the surface. They'd fill partially with sand and gravel over time, creating creek bed that looked solid but was actually a thin covering over vertical drops into darkness. A man could walk across what appeared to be stable ground and suddenly drop through, plunging into water that might be 20 feet deep or 100 feet deep, in darkness, with current pulling him into underwater passages where he couldn't turn around, couldn't surface, couldn't even tell which direction was up. The volcanic rock added another dimension of danger. Laid down during a period of intense volcanic activity millions of years ago, the dark stone contained sulfur compounds that reacted with water to release hydrogen sulfide gas. The gas was heavier than air, colorless, and deadly. At high concentrations, anything above 700 parts per million, it caused immediate loss of consciousness and death within minutes. At lower concentrations, it caused confusion, nausea, headaches, and impaired judgment. Critically, it also caused olfactory paralysis, meaning that after the initial rotten egg smell, victims lost their ability to smell the gas at all and had no warning they were being poisoned. In an open environment, hydrogen sulfide typically dissipates quickly, but Black Canyon Creek wasn't open. The middle section, roughly miles 10 through 30, ran through true canyon country, where walls rose 200 to 400 feet on both sides, sometimes closing in to create narrow gorges barely wider than the creek itself. In these confined spaces, especially during calm morning hours before wind picked up, hydrogen sulfide could accumulate in pockets and low-lying areas. A trapper checking his lines in a narrow section at dawn might walk into a gas pocket, become disoriented within seconds, and make fatal decisions without understanding that his judgment was compromised by poison. The hydrology created yet another layer of danger. Black Canyon Creek's steep gradient and confined canyon walls made it exceptionally vulnerable to flash flooding. The drainage basin collected runoff from over 200 square miles, funneling everything into that narrow channel. During thunderstorms, water levels could rise 20 or 30 feet in less than 15 minutes. But the floods didn't arrive as gradual rises. They came as walls of water, sudden surges that struck without warning and swept away everything in their path. The combination of surface flooding and underground water passages created conditions that were almost unprecedented. When flash floods hit Black Canyon Creek, water didn't just flow down the visible creek bed. It also flooded the underground chambers and passages, shooting up through solution pipes with tremendous force. A man standing near what looked like solid creek bed during a flash flood could suddenly have water erupt from beneath his feet, pulling him down into underground passages where surface rescuers would never find him. Even more disturbing, the underground flood surge could carry bodies significant distances through limestone caves and tunnels before depositing them in locations that made no sense based on surface geography. A man who disappeared at mile 15 might be found at mile 30, having traveled 15 miles underground through passages that connected sections of creek separated on the surface by ridges and canyon walls. Without understanding the underground hydrology, these discoveries seemed impossible. The kind of thing that made rational men start believing in supernatural forces. The beaver population along Black Canyon Creek was exceptional. The creek's varied gradient created ideal habitat, fast water and slow water in close proximity, deep pools alternating with shallow riffles, abundant willow and aspen for food, and dam construction. During the peak fur trade years of the 1820s and early 1830s, trappers who worked Black Canyon Creek could take 40 to 60 prime pelts in a season. Those numbers represented serious money. A year's worth of pelts from Black Canyon Creek could set a man up with enough capital to buy land, start a business, or support a family through multiple lean years. That economic incentive drew trappers to Black Canyon Creek despite warnings. Shoshone and Ute groups who hunted in the region had long traditions about the drainage. They called it the creek that breathes bad air and the place where water comes from below. Their oral histories included specific warnings about certain sections of canyon, certain pools, certain times of year when the dangers were highest. Young men from these tribes who wanted to prove their courage were sometimes sent to Black Canyon Creek as a test, but the test was recognizing when to leave, not staying to trap beaver. A young man who entered the canyon, assessed the risks, and chose to work elsewhere was considered wiser than one who stayed and succeeded through luck. European trappers heard these warnings and largely dismissed them as primitive superstition. They couldn't see the invisible hazards, the solution pipes hidden beneath sand, the toxic gases that came and went with weather conditions, the underground water passages that could swallow a man and carry him miles from where he entered. They saw clear water, abundant beaver, and economic opportunity. They didn't understand they were looking at one of the most dangerous locations in the American West. The first documented European death on Black Canyon Creek occurred in September 1834. Pierre Davout was a French-Canadian trapper, 32 years old, who'd been working the Rocky Mountains since 1829. He was experienced enough to survive 4 winters, careful enough to avoid the mistakes that killed less cautious men. He was working Black Canyon Creek with a partner during the early autumn trapping season, when beaver pelts were beginning to thicken for winter and commanded premium prices. Davout left camp on the morning of September 12, 1834, telling his partner he'd check the upstream trap line and return by afternoon. He was carrying standard gear: rifle, powder horn and shot pouch, knife, a leather bag for collected pelts, and basic survival equipment. The weather was clear, the creek was at normal late summer levels, and Davout had worked this same section of creek for 3 weeks without incident. There was no reason to expect trouble. When he didn't return by dark, his partner waited through the night, assuming Davout had decided to camp at the far end of the trap line rather than travel after dark. Experienced trappers did this routinely. Better to spend a night under the stars than risk a broken leg navigating rough terrain in darkness. But when Davout didn't appear by noon the following day, the partner went looking. He found Davout's body in a pool approximately 2 miles upstream from their camp. The trapper was face down in water that was perhaps 3 feet deep at the pool's center, shallower at the edges. There was a visible head wound, a gash above Davout's left temple where he'd apparently struck his head on a rock. The rocks around the pool were wet and slick, covered with algae that made footing treacherous. The death appeared straightforward enough. Davout had slipped on wet rocks, struck his head hard enough to stun or knock himself unconscious, and fallen into the pool. Unable to recover or right himself, he'd drowned in water that would have been survivable if he'd been conscious and able to stand. Tragic, but not mysterious. Men died in wilderness accidents constantly. The partner buried Davout on a hillside above the creek, marked the grave with stones, and reported the death at Fort Bridger when he came out of the mountains in October. Nobody questioned the explanation. Slipping on wet rocks was one of the most common ways trappers died. The head wound explained why a strong swimmer had drowned in a shallow pool. The case was closed in everyone's mind. Davout became another name in the long list of men who'd come west seeking fortune and found graves instead. But Pierre Davout's death established patterns that would only become clear in retrospect. He'd been found in water that seemed too shallow to drown a conscious man. The head wound was severe, but not immediately fatal. He'd been alive when he entered the water, which meant he'd drowned rather than dying from the head injury. And he'd been working alone, which meant there were no witnesses to what had actually happened in those final moments. These details wouldn't mean much until other men started dying in similar circumstances. Then trappers would remember Davout and wonder if his death had been as simple as it appeared. What if the head wound hadn't been caused by slipping? What if he'd hit his head while trying to escape something else? What if the real cause of death wasn't the fall, but whatever had made him fall? These questions were 2 years in the future when Pierre Davout died. For now, he was just another casualty of wilderness life, buried on a hillside where the creek's sound would be the only company his grave would ever have. Thomas Hendricks' death in September 1836 changed everything. It was too similar to Davout's death to ignore. Another September, another experienced trapper working alone, another drowning in water that seemed impossibly shallow. But the circumstances of Hendricks' death introduced elements that couldn't be explained away as simple accidents. Hendricks was 28 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, where he'd grown up hunting and trapping in the Allegheny Mountains. He'd come west in 1833, drawn by stories of fortunes to be made in beaver pelts. He'd survived 3 Rocky Mountain winters, which immediately placed him in the upper tier of trappers in terms of experience and capability. Men who survived 3 winters had learned what killed the others.
They knew how to read weather, recognize dangerous conditions, move safely through rough terrain, and make the thousand small decisions that meant the difference between survival and death. His partners described Hendricks as methodical and careful, never taking unnecessary risks. He'd had close calls, a grizzly encounter in 1835 that he'd survived by climbing a tree and waiting out the bear for 6 hours, a near drowning in the Snake River in 1834 when his horse had stumbled crossing during high water. Each close call had made him more cautious, not less. He was the kind of trapper who checked and double-checked his gear, who studied terrain before committing to a route, who'd rather spend an extra hour reaching safety than save time taking shortcuts. In mid-September 1836, Hendricks was working Black Canyon Creek with 2 partners. They'd established a base camp near the mouth of the canyon and were methodically working upstream, setting traps and checking them on a rotating schedule. The strategy was standard: spread traps over several miles of creek, check each section every 2 or 3 days, rotate through the trap lines to maintain constant pressure on the beaver population while allowing individual sections to rest between checks. On the morning of September 17, 1836, Hendricks left camp at
dawn to check the upper trap line. The weather was clear and cool, temperatures in the mid-40s Fahrenheit with no wind. Perfect trapping weather. The creek was at normal late summer levels, low enough to wade safely in most places, high enough that beaver were active. Hendricks was carrying his rifle, his knife, powder horn, and shot in a leather bag for pelts. He told his partners he'd check approximately 20 traps spread over 3 miles of creek and expected to be back by late afternoon. His partners watched him leave, heading upstream along the creek bank. Hendricks was wearing distinctive boots with a patch on the left heel where he'd repaired a worn spot. The patch made his tracks easy to identify, useful in country where multiple trappers might be working the same general area. They watched until he rounded a bend and disappeared into the canyon. Then they went back to camp maintenance, preparing gear and processing pelts from previous days' trapping. When Hendricks didn't return by dark, they weren't immediately concerned. He might have decided to check additional traps, or he might have encountered difficult conditions that slowed his progress. Experienced trappers didn't panic when someone was a few hours late. The mountains were unpredictable. Plans changed. The smart thing was to wait until morning rather than risk searching in darkness. But when dawn came and Hendricks still hadn't appeared, concern shifted to alarm. His partners gathered search gear and headed upstream, following the route Hendricks would have taken. They found his tracks easily. Those distinctive boots with the patched heel left clear impressions in the soft soil near the creek bank. The tracks showed Hendricks had been walking at a normal pace, not hurrying, not showing signs of distress or injury. They followed the tracks for roughly 2 miles, finding evidence that Hendricks had been checking his trap line as planned. The first 5 traps showed signs of recent attention. 2 had caught beaver. The pelts had been properly removed and stacked nearby, indicating Hendricks had been working methodically and competently. Everything suggested he was having a routine day of trapping. Then, approximately 2.5 miles from camp, at a relatively flat section of creek bank with no obvious hazards, Hendricks' tracks simply stopped. Not gradually, not with signs of him leaving the trail or entering the water. The tracks just ended, as if Thomas Hendricks had taken one final step and then ceased to exist. His partners studied the area with growing confusion and dread.
The last clear boot print showed his left foot, the one with the patched heel, placed normally, with the proper weight distribution of a man walking steadily. Beyond that print, nothing. They searched the immediate area exhaustively. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn vegetation. No indication that Hendricks had been attacked by a bear or a mountain lion. No tracks suggesting other
humans had been present. The creek at that location ran clear over smooth stones, the water perhaps 18 inches deep in the center, shallower near the banks. There were no deep pools nearby where a body might be trapped underwater, no place to hide, no features that suggested any kind of danger. The mystery deepened as they expanded their search. They worked both upstream and downstream from where the tracks ended, checking every pool, every undercut bank, every place where a body might lodge. They searched for hours, then days, finding nothing. They examined the surrounding forest and hillsides, thinking perhaps Hendricks had been spooked by a grizzly and left the creek entirely. Still, nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no scuff marks on rocks. Nothing to indicate where Thomas Hendricks had gone. By the third day, they were convinced something truly inexplicable had occurred. Men didn't just vanish. There had to be tracks, signs, evidence of what happened. But Black Canyon Creek had swallowed Thomas Hendricks as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving only those last footprints as proof he'd been there at all. On the fourth day of searching, Samuel Yates, a trapper working independently farther downstream, made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Yates had been checking his own trap lines approximately 15 miles downstream from where Hendricks' tracks had disappeared. This section of Black Canyon Creek was different from the upper reaches, more open, less confined, with the creek running through a broader valley. Yates knew about the missing trapper but wasn't actively involved in the search. He was simply going about his business, checking traps, when he spotted what he initially thought was a beaver lodge partially submerged in a shallow pool. Something about it didn't look right. Beaver lodges had a certain shape, a certain texture. This looked wrong. Yates approached carefully, leaning down to get a better view, and his stomach lurched when he realized what he was seeing. It was a body, face down in water barely deep enough to cover it. Yates shouted for help, though he was alone and no one could hear him. He waded into the pool, which was perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, the water varying from 4 inches at the edges to maybe 18 inches at the center. When he reached the body and turned it over, he saw the face of a man he didn't know, but whose description matched the missing trapper everyone was searching for. Thomas Hendricks lay in that shallow pool, his body remarkably preserved by cold water. His rifle was 10 yards upstream, wedged between rocks, the barrel pointed back toward the pool as if he'd dropped it or thrown it behind him while trying to escape something. His powder horn was completely dry, carefully kept out of the water even as he died. The reflex of a man who knew his survival depended on keeping his powder dry. His knife remained sheathed at his belt, unused, suggesting he'd never drawn it or never had time to use it. But what made Yates step back? What made his skin crawl despite years of seeing death in various forms was the bruising. Dark purple marks covered Hendricks' neck and shoulders, so dark they were nearly black. The pattern looked almost like handprints, large handprints, impossibly large, placed at angles that didn't match human anatomy. The marks suggested someone, or something, had gripped Hendricks with tremendous force, holding him with such strength that the pressure had burst blood vessels beneath his skin. Yates examined the body carefully, looking for other injuries that might explain the death. There were none. No claw marks, ruling out bears or mountain lions. No arrow wounds, no bullet holes, no stab wounds. No broken bones that might have prevented Hendricks from fighting back or escaping. Just those impossible bruises and lungs full of creek water. The location made no sense. To reach this spot from where Hendricks' tracks had disappeared would have required traveling roughly 15 miles downstream, passing through some of the most difficult terrain in the canyon. There were sections where vertical rock walls forced travelers to climb out of the canyon entirely. Other sections where the creek ran through narrow gorges, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. The journey would have taken hours under the best conditions, longer if Hendricks was injured or fleeing from something. Why would an experienced trapper travel 15 miles in the wrong direction, away from his camp, away from his partners, away from everything that represented safety? And how had he made that journey without leaving any tracks whatsoever? The ground near the pool was soft enough to hold impressions. Yates' own boots left clear prints, but there were no tracks showing how Hendricks had arrived at that location. It was as if he'd been dropped from the sky directly into the water. Yates called for Hendricks' partners, who'd expanded their search into the lower canyon. When they arrived and saw the body, saw the location, saw the complete absence of any logical explanation, their faces went pale. They stood in silence for a long time, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Finally, one of them spoke. "This ain't possible. There's no way he got here from where we lost his tracks. And even if he did somehow make it this far, why? He was heading back to camp. Everything he needed was upstream, not down. And how the hell did he drown in 6 inches of water?" They had no answers. They stood around the body, experienced men who'd seen death in various forms, and none of them could explain what they were looking at. The death violated everything they understood about how the world worked. Samuel Yates, still standing in the water, felt something with his foot. He looked down and saw that the bottom of the pool wasn't uniform. There was a depression, hole, directly beneath where Hendricks' body had lain. Yates found a long stick and probed the opening carefully. The stick descended 15 feet before touching anything solid. The hole was perhaps 3 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, dropping vertically into darkness. The edges were smooth, water-worn, as if this had been formed by natural processes over a very long time. "There's a shaft here," Yates said quietly. "Goes down at least 15 feet, maybe more. The pool looks shallow, but there's this vertical drop right in the middle." The other trappers waded in to see. They took turns probing the shaft with sticks, trying to determine its depth and extent. The shaft appeared to continue beyond where their sticks could reach, and they could feel current pulling water down into the opening. This was the first documented discovery of what geologists would later identify as a solution pipe, a vertical shaft formed by acidic water dissolving limestone along natural fracture lines. The discovery provided a partial explanation for Hendricks' death. He'd somehow ended up at this location and stepped into the shaft, dropping suddenly into water that was much deeper than it appeared from the surface. In the shock and confusion of the fall, in the darkness of the shaft, with current pulling him deeper, Even a strong swimmer might panic and drown. But this explanation created as many questions as it answered. How had Hendricks reached this location 15 miles from where he was last seen? Why had he traveled so far in the wrong direction? What caused the bruising on his neck and shoulders? And why were there no tracks showing his approach to the pool? The trappers debated what to do with the body. Moving it would be difficult. They were miles from any settlement, deep in difficult country, and Hendricks was a large man. Some wanted to bury him on site. Others argued for taking him to Fort Bridger to report the death properly and allow examination by someone with medical training. While they argued, Yates continued exploring the pool and the surrounding area. He found something that made him call the others over immediately. On the upstream side of the pool, hidden by an overhang of rock, there was an opening, a cave mouth, perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, just above the current water level. Water flowed out of this opening, not a lot, but steady, indicating it connected to some larger underground system. Yates borrowed a lantern and crawled carefully into the opening. The passage continued for about 10 feet before opening into a larger chamber. The chamber was perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand. Water flowed through the chamber from another passage at the far end. The walls were limestone, smooth and water-worn, and scattered around the chamber floor were items that made Yates' blood run cold. A powder horn, similar to Hendricks, but older, the leather strap broken. Several pieces
of what looked like old leather clothing, rotted and falling apart. Animal bones, some of them looking like they'd been gnawed, and half buried in sand, what appeared to be human finger bones. Yates backed out of the cave carefully and reported what he'd found. The trappers exchanged glances. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. This was evidence that Black Canyon Creek had been claiming victims for longer than anyone knew. That bodies and belongings were being washed into underground chambers where they'd never be found by surface searchers. They decided to bury Thomas Hendricks on a ridge above the creek, where the ground was solid and the view extended for miles. They marked the grave with stones stacked carefully, arranged so the marker would last for years. They said what prayers they remembered, though none of them were particularly religious men. Then they gathered their gear, abandoned their trap lines, and left Black Canyon Creek as quickly as their horses could carry them. None of them spoke during the ride back to Fort Bridger. What was there to say? They'd found their partner dead in impossible circumstances. They'd discovered evidence of other deaths that no one had investigated. They'd seen things that suggested Black Canyon Creek was far more dangerous than anyone had realized, in ways that didn't match normal wilderness hazards. At Fort Bridger, they reported Hendricks' death to the post commander and to representatives of the fur company that employed them. Their account was met with skepticism. The idea that an experienced trapper had somehow traveled 15 miles through rough country, drowned in shallow water, and ended up with mysterious bruising. It sounded like the kind of story men invented to cover up their own failures, or to avoid admitting they'd abandoned a partner in need. But the trappers stuck to their story. They drew maps showing where Hendricks had disappeared and where he'd been found. They described the shaft in the pool floor, the cave system, the evidence of previous deaths. They refused to return to Black Canyon Creek regardless of economic incentives offered. Word of Hendricks' death spread through the trapping community quickly. Some dismissed it as an accident that had been overcomplicated by men who didn't understand what they'd seen. Others noted the similarities to Pierre Davout's death 2 years earlier and started to wonder if there was a pattern. A few trappers who'd worked Black Canyon Creek in previous years came forward with stories of strange experiences they'd mostly kept quiet about.
sounds in the canyon that didn't match any animal they knew, the sensation of being watched, water behaving in ways that seemed wrong. But most trappers continued working the creek. The beaver were too abundant, the economic incentive too strong. They took precautions, working in larger groups, avoiding the sections where Davout and Hendricks had died, moving through the canyon quickly rather than lingering. They told themselves that Hendricks had simply been unlucky, that lightning rarely struck twice, that understanding the hazards meant they could avoid them. Then, William Cord disappeared, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Cord was 32 years old, from Ohio originally, and had been trapping in the Rockies since 1830. 6 years in the mountains was a significant achievement. It meant he'd survived numerous winters, navigated territorial disputes with various Native American groups, avoided or survived encounters with dangerous wildlife, and mastered the 100 skills that separated successful trappers from dead ones. His partners described him as paranoid in the best possible way. He tied safety ropes when crossing difficult water. He avoided working alone whenever possible. He studied terrain carefully before committing to any route. He maintained his gear obsessively, checking and rechecking everything. These weren't the habits of a man who made careless mistakes. In late October 1836, just 5 weeks after Hendricks' death, Cord was working Black Canyon Creek with 2 partners. They hadn't known about Hendricks when they chose this drainage. News traveled slowly in the mountains, and they'd been working in the high country all summer, out of contact with other trappers. They'd come down to Black Canyon Creek in early October, drawn by reports of abundant beaver, and established a base camp near the mouth of the canyon. For 3 weeks, everything went smoothly. They worked the lower reaches of the creek methodically, taking good numbers of prime pelts. The weather held clear and cold, perfect for trapping. The beaver were plentiful and relatively easy to catch. They congratulated themselves on choosing such productive territory and made plans to work the creek through November before pulling back for winter. On October 23rd, Cord told his partners he was going to check the eastern tributary, a smaller stream that fed into Black Canyon Creek about 12 miles upstream from their base camp. The tributary was known to hold beaver, though accessing it required navigating steep, rocky terrain. Cord estimated he'd be gone most of the day, checking traps they'd set the previous week and possibly setting additional lines if conditions looked good. He left at dawn, carrying his rifle, his knife, powder and shot, and supplies for an overnight camp if necessary. His partners watched him leave, heading upstream along a game trail that paralleled the creek. Cord was in good spirits, joking about bringing back enough pelts to retire from trapping and open a tavern in St. Louis. His partners laughed and told him to bring back whiskey instead of pelts. It was the last time they'd see him alive. When Cord didn't return by dark, they weren't concerned. The tributary was rough country. He might have decided to camp overnight rather than risk navigating dangerous ground in darkness. When he didn't appear by mid-morning, next day they started to worry. By noon, they were searching. They found his camp approximately 8 miles upstream, tucked into a small clearing near where the tributary joined the main creek. The site was perfect. Flat ground for sleeping, good drainage, proximity to water, clear sight lines for security. Cord had established his camp with the efficiency of long experience. His fire had burned down to coals, but was still warm, suggesting he'd built it within the last 12 to 18 hours. His bedroll was laid out neatly. His pack hung from a tree branch, out of reach of bears and other animals. What stopped his partners in their tracks was the meal. Dried venison and cornmeal sat beside the fire, half-eaten, as if Cord had been interrupted mid-meal. The plate, a flat piece of bark, still held food. A wooden spoon lay beside it. Everything suggested Cord had been eating dinner, had set down his spoon, and had stood up to… what? Investigate something? Answer a call of nature? Check on his horse? His horse was still there, tethered to a tree about 30 yards from the fire. The animal was calm, well fed, showing no signs of distress or recent panic. If something threatening had approached the camp, the horse would have reacted. But the animal stood placidly, as if nothing unusual had happened. Cord's rifle leaned against a log by the fire, loaded and ready, exactly where a cautious man would place it for quick access. His powder horn hung nearby. His knife. His partners searched the camp carefully but couldn't find Cord's knife. It wasn't in its usual spot on his belt, which suggested he'd been wearing it when he left camp. His tracks led from the fire to the creek bank, approximately 30 feet away. They showed Cord walking normally, not running, not stumbling. He'd walked toward the creek with normal stride length and pace. But the tracks stopped several feet back from the water's edge, on solid ground. They didn't continue to the creek. They didn't turn aside to follow the bank. They simply ended, as if William Cord had taken one more step and vanished from the physical world. His partners searched frantically. They worked both the main creek and the tributary, checking every pool, every overhang, every place where a body might lodge or a man might take shelter. They found nothing. They expanded their search to the surrounding forest, thinking perhaps he'd been spooked by a grizzly or a hostile war party. They found no tracks, no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn vegetation, nothing to indicate where Cord had gone or what had happened to him. They searched for 3 days, covering every inch of terrain within 2 miles of the camp in all directions. On the evening of the 3rd day, exhausted and terrified, they made a decision. They would return to Fort Bridger, report Cord missing, and organize a larger search party with more men and resources. At Fort Bridger, the post commander listened to their report with growing concern. This was the second experienced trapper to vanish from Black Canyon Creek in less than 2 months. The commander organized a search party of 15 men, trappers, scouts, and several Shoshone hunters who knew the territory. They returned to Cord's camp in early November and spent a full week searching. They found the camp exactly as Cord's partners had described it. The half-eaten meal, the fire burned to coals, the horse still tethered, the tracks that stopped impossibly. They found nothing new, no signs of Cord, no indication of what had happened to him. The Shoshone hunters examined the site carefully, reading sign that the European trappers missed. One of them, an older man named Running Wolf, stood at the spot where Cord's tracks ended and studied the ground for a long time. Finally, he spoke through an interpreter. "This place is not good. The water here takes people. Our people know this. We do not camp near this creek. We pass through quickly. The mountain breathes bad air here. The water comes from below as well as above. Your friend is gone. You will not find him." The European trappers pressed for more information. How did the water take people? Where did they go? What was the danger specifically? Running Wolf shook his head. He knew what he knew from oral traditions passed down through generations, but he didn't have the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to explain complex geology and hydrology to men who didn't share his language or worldview. All he could say was that the place was dangerous, that his people avoided it, and that Cord was almost certainly dead. The search was called off in mid-November as winter weather began to set in. Heavy snow was falling in the high country. The creek was starting to freeze. Continuing the search would risk additional lives for minimal chance of finding Cord's body. The official conclusion was that Cord had been killed by a person or persons unknown, possibly a hostile Native American group, possibly white renegades, possibly an animal attack that had dragged his body into the creek where it had been swept downstream and lodged somewhere underwater. His partners refused to accept these explanations. They'd seen the camp. They'd seen where the tracks ended. Whatever had happened to William Cord wasn't a normal accident or attack. Something about Black Canyon Creek was wrong in ways that transcended conventional dangers. They left Wyoming Territory entirely, abandoning not just Black Canyon Creek, but the entire region. One returned to Ohio, the other traveled to Oregon Territory. Both men would spend the rest of their lives troubled by what they'd seen, telling anyone who'd listen that something evil lived in Black Canyon Creek, something that took men without leaving traces. For 3 months, William Cord's disappearance remained a mystery. Then, on March 4th, 1837, trappers working the lower reaches of Black Canyon Creek made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the entire frontier trapping community. The trappers, a group of 5 men who'd come west together from Missouri, had heard about the deaths and disappearances on Black Canyon Creek, but had dismissed them as exaggerated stories meant to scare off competition. They were experienced men who'd trapped various rivers and creeks throughout the Rockies. They weren't afraid of superstitions or tall tales. They'd come to Black Canyon Creek specifically because other trappers were avoiding it, which meant abundant beaver and no competition. They'd been working the creek for 2 weeks when one of them spotted what appeared to be a log wedged beneath a limestone overhang in a section of creek they'd passed multiple times. Something about the log looked wrong. The color wasn't right. The shape didn't match. One of the trappers waded over to investigate. It wasn't a log. It was William Cord's body. The trapper who discovered it shouted for his companions, his voice cracking with shock. They gathered around the body, which was positioned beneath an overhang in water approximately 2 feet deep, wearing all his clothes, his knife still in its sheath. The cold water and winter temperatures had preserved him remarkably well. He was recognizable, his features clear enough that they could describe him accurately when they later reported the discovery. But it was Cord's face, his expression, that would haunt these men for the rest of their lives. William Cord's features were frozen in what appeared to be absolute, overwhelming terror. His eyes were wide open, pupils dilated, staring at something. His mouth was stretched in what might have been a scream. His hands were raised in front of his face, fingers curved as if trying to ward off something that was coming at him. One of the trappers, a man named Samuel Briggs, who'd seen death in various forms during the Civil War before coming west, later said that he'd never seen an expression like that on a corpse. "I've seen men die in battle," he wrote in a letter to his family. "I've seen men die slow from gut wounds, die fast from bullets through the heart, die screaming from artillery fire.
But I ain't never seen a man's face frozen in terror like Cord's was. Whatever he saw in his last moments, whatever happened to him, it scared him more than any mortal danger I've ever witnessed. The trappers examined Cord's body carefully. There were no visible injuries, no broken bones, no bullet wounds, no claw marks, no indication he'd been attacked by animals or humans. No signs of illness or disease. William Cord appeared to have died of fright. Or more accurately, his physical cause of death was drowning, but something had terrified him so completely that his face had frozen in that expression of horror. The location made no sense. This section of creek was approximately 3 miles downstream from where Cord's camp had been found, which meant his body had somehow traveled 3 miles through rough country and ended up in a location that his searchers had thoroughly examined multiple times. The trappers who'd found Cord's camp had searched this exact section of creek. They were certain of this. They'd compared notes, cross-referenced their search grids, verified with each other that every inch of terrain had been covered. Yet there was William Cord, his body positioned beneath an overhang that had been checked by multiple searchers who'd found nothing. Either the body hadn't been there during the original searches, which seemed impossible given how wedged it was beneath the overhang, or the searchers had somehow missed a body in plain sight, which seemed equally impossible given their thoroughness. The trappers who discovered Cord pulled his body from the water and laid it on the creek bank. They examined the immediate area, looking for clues about how he'd ended up there. They found nothing unusual, just rocks, water, and the limestone overhang that had sheltered his body through the winter months. One of them noticed something and called the others over. The water beneath the overhang, where Cord had lain, wasn't uniform in depth. There was a depression, a hole, in the creek bed. Using a long stick, they probed the opening and found it descended at least 20 feet before touching anything solid. The hole was roughly 4 feet in diameter, its edges smooth and water-worn. Another solution pipe. Another vertical shaft connecting the surface to underground passages. And suddenly, a pattern was emerging. Thomas Hendricks found near a solution pipe. William Cord found near a solution pipe. Both men drowned in water that seemed too shallow to kill them, unless there were vertical shafts beneath the surface that could trap a man in water much deeper than it appeared. The trappers reported their discovery at Fort Bridger, bringing with them detailed descriptions of the body's location and condition. The post commander, now dealing with 3 deaths and disappearances on Black Canyon Creek in less than 3 years, made an official recommendation to the fur companies. Black Canyon Creek should be declared off-limits to company trappers. The economic value of the beaver population didn't justify the risk to human life. Most trappers didn't need to be told twice. Word of Cord's fate, particularly the description of his expression, spread quickly through the mountain community. Men who'd been willing to risk normal wilderness dangers weren't willing to risk whatever had caused that look on Cord's face. By late March 1837, Black Canyon Creek was effectively abandoned by the trapping community. But one man, driven by economic desperation or stubborn refusal to believe the stories, decided to work the creek one final time. His name was Jacob Morrison, and his death would add the last, most inexplicable detail to Black Canyon Creek's reputation as cursed ground. Morrison was 34 years old and had spent 15 winters in the Rocky Mountains. His partner described him as one of the most competent trappers in the region, careful, experienced, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and weather. Morrison had survived situations that killed other men. He'd been caught in avalanches twice and dug himself out both times.
He'd been attacked by a grizzly bear and survived by playing dead for over an hour while the bear fed on his horse. He'd been trapped by blizzards without shelter and had made it through by digging snow caves and rationing his supplies with mathematical precision. Morrison wasn't reckless. He was calculated. He studied risks carefully and only took chances when he believed the odds favored survival. When he decided to work Black Canyon Creek in March 1837, he did so with full knowledge of the deaths and disappearances. He simply didn't believe the supernatural explanations. He thought Hendricks and Cord had made mistakes. Understandable mistakes that any man might make, but mistakes nonetheless. He believed he was skilled enough to avoid those mistakes. He also needed the money. 15 years of trapping had worn his body down. His joints ached constantly from years of cold water and heavy lifting. His fingers had limited mobility from repeated frostbite. He'd told his partner that this would be his last season in the mountains. One final spring gathering beaver pelts. Then he'd return to civilization with enough capital to live comfortably for his remaining years. Black Canyon Creek represented that final score. With most trappers avoiding the drainage, Morrison could work it alone without competition. The beaver population had recovered during the months of reduced trapping pressure. Morrison estimated he could take 60 to 70 prime pelts in a month of work, more than enough to make his retirement fund. His partner, a younger man named Thomas Wade, argued against the plan. Wade had heard all the stories about Black Canyon Creek. He'd seen the fear in other trappers' eyes when they talked about that drainage. He tried to convince Morrison to work safer territory, even if it meant smaller returns. Morrison dismissed his concerns. Men die in the mountains because they make mistakes or they get unlucky. I don't make mistakes, and I've used up my bad luck years ago. Black Canyon Creek is just a creek. Water and rocks and beaver, same as any other drainage. All those stories are just men trying to explain away their own failures or their partner's deaths. Wade couldn't convince him otherwise, so they reached a compromise. Morrison would work the lower reaches of Black Canyon Creek, the sections that seemed least dangerous. He'd work during the day only, never alone after dark. He'd check in with Wade daily. At the first sign of anything unusual, he'd leave immediately. They established a base camp several miles below where Cord's body had been found, in a relatively open section where the canyon widened into a valley. The location felt safer than the narrow upper canyon. They could see for considerable distances in all directions. The creek ran slower here, more predictable. For 2 weeks, Morrison trapped successfully. He took good numbers of beaver, high-quality pelts that would command premium prices. He experienced no unusual incidents. The weather held clear. The creek behaved predictably. Each evening he returned to camp with pelts and stories about how foolish other trappers had been to abandon such productive territory. March in the Rockies is a treacherous time. Winter hasn't released its grip, but spring is beginning to assert itself. The result is wildly unstable weather conditions. Temperatures can swing 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Clear mornings can turn into blizzards by afternoon. Most critically, the snow that has accumulated in the high country all winter begins to melt when daytime temperatures rise above freezing, creating runoff conditions that can turn placid creeks into raging torrents without warning. Experienced trappers, men like Morrison, knew March was dangerous for creek work. They also knew that beaver pelts were prime in March, thick and luxurious,
commanding the highest prices of the year. The economic incentive often outweighed the caution that should have kept men away from dangerous water. On March 15, 1837, Morrison left camp at dawn to check trap lines along the lower creek. The temperature was just above freezing, cold but not dangerously so. The sky was overcast but not threatening. Morrison told Wade he'd check a dozen traps scattered over 2 miles of creek and would be back by early afternoon. Wade stayed in camp, processing pelts from previous days' catches. Around mid-morning, he heard something that made him stop working and listen carefully. It came from the direction of the creek, a deep, rumbling roar that started low and built steadily, holding for perhaps 30 seconds before fading away. The sound was distinct from thunder. It had a focused, directional quality, and it seemed to come from beneath the ground as much as from the air. Wade had heard similar sounds before. They were characteristic of flash floods, the noise of large volumes of water moving suddenly through confined spaces. But the sound made no sense in this context. The weather had been clear. There'd been no heavy rain, no rapid snowmelt in the high country that would cause the creek to surge. The water level when Morrison left camp had been normal, perhaps even slightly lower than previous days. Wade stood, uneasy, and walked to where he could see the creek. The water level appeared unchanged. There was no surge, no obvious increase in flow. He told himself he'd imagined the sound, or mistaken it for something else. But the uneasiness remained, a feeling in his gut that something was wrong. When Morrison didn't return by noon, Wade's uneasiness shifted to alarm. When he didn't appear by mid-afternoon, Wade grabbed his rifle and went searching, following the route Morrison would have taken. He found Morrison at the bottom of a dry gulch, approximately 50 feet above the creek bed. The gulch was a seasonal drainage that carried water only during heavy rain or rapid snowmelt. At the time Wade found Morrison, the gulch was completely dry, nothing but rocks, sand, and scattered vegetation. Jacob Morrison lay at the bottom of that dry gulch, soaking wet. His clothes were saturated. Water dripped from his hair and beard. A pool of water had formed around his body, soaking into the dry sand. And when Wade turned Morrison over and tried to revive him, water poured from Morrison's mouth, cup after cup of water. More water than seemed possible for a human body to contain. Morrison was dead. He had drowned in a dry gulch 50 feet above the creek. Wade stared at the impossible scene, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Men didn't drown in dry gulches. Water didn't spontaneously appear and disappear. The physical world didn't work this way. Yet there was Morrison, dead from drowning, lying in a location where there was no water and had been no water. Wade examined the gulch frantically, looking for an explanation. He checked the rocks and sand for signs of recent wetness. The ground showed no indication that water had been present recently. There were no water marks on the rocks, no debris deposited by flowing water, no trace of moisture beyond what was draining from Morrison's body. The gulch was as dry as it had been for weeks, except for the dead man lying in it. He checked Morrison's body for other injuries. There were none. No broken bones that might have resulted from a fall. No wounds suggesting animal attack. No signs of illness. Morrison had drowned, purely and simply. But he'd drowned in a location where drowning should have been impossible. Wade looked up at the creek, trying to understand. The water was running at normal levels, perhaps even slightly lower than it had been that morning. There was no evidence of flooding, no signs that water had surged out of the creek bed and into the gulch. The banks showed no erosion, no high water marks, nothing to suggest the creek had risen significantly in recent hours. Then Wade remembered the sound he'd heard, the deep, rumbling roar that had come from the direction of the creek, but seemed to come from underground. He looked at the dry gulch again, looked at Morrison's waterlogged body, and a terrible possibility occurred to him. What if water could travel underground? What if Black Canyon Creek had passages and chambers beneath its surface? Passages that could flood suddenly and violently. What if Morrison had been in the wrong place when one of those underground surges erupted, had been caught by water coming from below rather than above, had been swept into an underground chamber and drowned there before being deposited back on the surface in a location that made no sense? The theory was insane. It violated everything Wade understood about how water behaved, but it was the only explanation that fit the evidence. And it suggested that Black Canyon Creek was even more dangerous than anyone had realized, that the hazards weren't just in the visible creek, but in an entire unseen system of underground water flow that could kill without warning. Wade ran back to camp, his nerve completely broken. He gathered only the most essential gear, his rifle, his knife, basic survival equipment, and left everything else. He didn't bury Morrison. He didn't even cover the body. He simply fled, riding his horse through the night until he reached Fort Bridger 24 hours later, exhausted and half mad with fear. His report was met with stunned silence. The post commander listened to the description of Morrison's death, the dry gulch, the waterlogged body, the impossibility of drowning without water, and knew that Black Canyon Creek had crossed from dangerous into something that defied rational explanation. A recovery party was sent to retrieve Morrison's body. They found everything exactly as Wade had described it. Morrison lying in the dry gulch, the ground showing no signs of recent water flow, the body clearly drowned, despite the complete absence of water in the location. They examined the area extensively, looking for an explanation that made sense. They found none. One of the recovery party, a trapper named James Colton, who had some education in natural philosophy, proposed a theory. He suggested that Black Canyon Creek had extensive underground water passages, that sudden pressure surges in these passages could force water to erupt to the surface through vertical shafts or fissures, and that Morrison had been caught by such an eruption, drowned by water that came from below and then receded back underground, leaving no surface trace. The theory was speculative, based on minimal evidence, but it was the only explanation that accounted for what they were seeing. Colton pointed out that they'd found solution pipes near where Hendricks and Cord had died. These pipes connected to underground systems. If the systems could flood suddenly during certain conditions, they could create exactly the kind of impossible deaths they'd been investigating. The recovery party buried Jacob Morrison on the same ridge where Thomas Hendricks lay, his grave marked with stones. They left Black Canyon Creek and recommended in the strongest possible terms that the entire drainage be declared permanently off limits to all trapping activity. By April 1837, Black Canyon Creek's reputation was established throughout the Rocky Mountain trapping community. 3 experienced men dead in 6 months, all in circumstances that seemed impossible. The deaths shared disturbing similarities: drowning in water that appeared too shallow, bodies found in locations that made no sense, expressions of terror or evidence of having been gripped by something with tremendous force. Trappers refused to work the drainage, regardless of economic incentives. The fur companies stopped even trying to recruit men for Black Canyon Creek.
The abundant beaver population was effectively protected by fear and superstition. But a few individuals, scientists, naturalists, men with formal education in geology and natural philosophy, began to take interest in Black Canyon Creek not as a source of beaver pelts, but as a natural phenomenon that deserved systematic study. If the deaths could be explained through natural processes, if the impossible circumstances were actually the result of unusual but real geological and hydrological conditions, then studying Black Canyon Creek might reveal something important about how nature worked in extreme environments. Dr. Marcus Whitman, a medical missionary and naturalist passing through Wyoming Territory in 1838, was one of the first to approach Black Canyon Creek with scientific rigor rather than frontier superstition. Whitman had studied medicine at a formal institution, had read extensively in natural philosophy and geology, and was skeptical of supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. Whitman spent 3 weeks studying Black Canyon Creek in May and June of 1838. He never worked alone and rarely ventured far from his companions, but he conducted systematic observations of the creek's features, took samples of water and rock, and interviewed trappers who'd worked the drainage before the deaths began. His findings, recorded in letters to colleagues in the East and later published in a scientific journal, provided the first comprehensive analysis of what made Black Canyon Creek so extraordinarily dangerous. Whitman documented over 30 solution pipes along a 5-mile stretch of the creek. These vertical shafts ranged from 2 to 6 feet in diameter and descended from 20 feet to over 200 feet into the limestone bedrock. Most were hidden beneath layers of sand or gravel, making them invisible from the surface and creating deadly traps for anyone who stepped on them. But Whitman's most significant discovery was documenting how these solution pipes behaved during flash flood conditions. He observed several thunderstorms that produced sudden runoff, and he noted that water levels in Black Canyon Creek could rise 20 feet in less than 15 minutes. During these floods, water didn't just flow down the surface creek bed. It also flooded the underground passages and chambers that connected through the solution pipes. Whitman witnessed water erupting from solution pipes with tremendous force during a flash flood, shooting 10 feet or more into the air like geysers. The eruptions lasted only seconds, but they were violent enough to knock a man off his feet or pull him down into the shaft. After the surface flood passed, water would continue flowing underground for hours, draining through the limestone passages at a much slower rate. This explains several of the mystery deaths. A man caught near a solution pipe during a flash flood could be pulled into underground passages and drowned in darkness, in water deep enough to be fatal. His body could be carried significant distances through underground channels before being deposited in a surface location miles from where he disappeared. The underground journey would leave no tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing but the body in an impossible location. Whitman also documented the hydrogen sulfide gas releases. He measured gas concentrations at various locations along the creek and found that certain sections, particularly narrow gorges with limited air circulation, could accumulate dangerous levels of the gas during calm weather conditions. The gas caused disorientation, nausea, and impaired judgment at sublethal concentrations. At higher concentrations, it caused immediate unconsciousness and death within minutes. A man affected by hydrogen sulfide might wander away from safe locations, might walk into dangerous water without recognizing the hazard, might make fatal decisions without understanding his judgment was compromised. The gas also explains some of the impossible aspects of the deaths. why experienced trappers would end up in locations they should have avoided, why they'd fail to take obvious safety precautions, why they'd sometimes drown in water where a rational person should have been able to save themselves. Whitman's scientific investigation provided natural explanations for phenomena that had seemed supernatural. Solution pipes created hidden vertical shafts where men could fall into water much deeper than it appeared. Underground passages allowed bodies to be transported to impossible locations. Flash floods could surge through these underground systems, creating deadly conditions that disappeared as quickly as they'd formed. Toxic gases could impair judgment and cause victims to walk into dangers they'd normally avoid. But even Whitman's thorough investigation left some questions unanswered. What had caused the bruising on Thomas Hendricks' neck and shoulders? Why had William Cord's face been frozen in such extreme terror? How had Jacob Morrison ended up in a dry gulch 50 feet from the creek, drowned but with no water source nearby? Whitman speculated that the bruising might have been caused by being tumbled through underground passages during a flash flood, with rocks and debris battering the body. The terror on Cord's face might have been caused by sudden realization he was being poisoned by gas, combined with the panic of being unable to escape. Morrison's death might have been caused by a sudden eruption of water from a solution pipe in the gulch during underground flooding, with the water receding back underground afterward. These explanations were plausible, but not definitive. They required assuming conditions that hadn't been directly observed, but they were far more credible than supernatural forces or malevolent spirits. Whitman's work established the scientific framework for understanding Black Canyon Creek's dangers, but it didn't make the drainage any safer. The hazards he documented, solution pipes, underground flooding, toxic gases, were still present. If anything, understanding the mechanisms made Black Canyon Creek seem more dangerous, not less. At least with supernatural explanations, you could imagine protective rituals or ways to appease angry spirits. Natural hazards didn't care about rituals. They operated according to physical laws that had no interest in human survival. The Native American perspective on Black Canyon Creek deserves careful attention because it reveals how different knowledge systems approach the same dangerous reality from different conceptual frameworks. Shoshone and Ute groups who hunted in the region had oral traditions about Black Canyon Creek that went back generations before European contact. These traditions described the drainage as a place where the mountain breathes bad air, where water comes from below as well as above, and where men who entered alone sometimes didn't return. Western observers often dismissed these accounts as primitive superstition, but embedded in the oral traditions were specific, practical warnings that reflected accurate understanding of the creek's hazards. Shoshone hunters told trappers not to work the narrow canyon sections during late summer when thunderstorms could cause sudden flooding, a warning that matched exactly the flash flood patterns Whitman documented scientifically. They advised against camping near the creek bed itself, preferring to sleep on ridges above the drainage, which made sense given the risks of underground flooding and toxic gas accumulation in low-lying areas. They warned specifically about certain pools and sections of creek that looked safe but were dangerous. When these locations were later investigated, they proved to be areas where solution pipes existed or where hydrogen sulfide concentrations were particularly high. The oral traditions weren't superstitious nonsense. They were practical safety information, accumulated over generations of observation, encoded in spiritual and narrative frameworks, because that was how information was transmitted in oral cultures. One Shoshone elder, interviewed by traders in 1840, described Black Canyon Creek as a place of testing, where young men went to prove their courage and wisdom. But the test wasn't to conquer supernatural forces or demonstrate physical bravery. The test was recognizing danger accurately and responding appropriately. A young man who entered the canyon, assessed the risks correctly, and chose to leave without taking beaver, was considered wiser than one who stayed and succeeded through luck. This tradition reflects sophisticated understanding that some environments are too dangerous to work, no matter how attractive the resources. It values correct risk assessment over false bravery, wisdom over machismo. It's a survival strategy encoded in cultural practice. The Ute had similar traditions, with additional specific details about seasonal variations and danger. Their oral histories noted that Black Canyon Creek was particularly dangerous during spring melt and late summer thunderstorm season, exactly the times when flash flooding was most likely. They described certain morning conditions, still air, heavy clouds, a particular smell, as signs that entering the canyon that day would be fatal. The smell they described matches hydrogen sulfide, and the weather conditions they warned about match exactly when gas would accumulate most dangerously. These indigenous knowledge systems didn't need modern geology to recognize that Black Canyon Creek was dangerous. Centuries of observation, coupled with oral traditions that preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations, provided practical understanding that was just as valid and considerably more useful for survival than formal scientific analysis. The tragedy of the Black Canyon Creek deaths wasn't just that men died. It was that they died despite knowledge existing that could have saved them. Native American groups knew the drainage was dangerous and had developed specific practices for working around those dangers. If European trappers had been willing to listen, to learn, to respect indigenous knowledge rather than dismissing it as superstition, Hendricks and Cord and Morrison might have lived. But cultural arrogance prevented that knowledge transfer. European trappers operated under assumptions of cultural superiority that made it difficult to accept that Native Americans possessed sophisticated environmental knowledge. When indigenous peoples warned about dangerous locations, trappers often heard the spiritual framework, angry spirits, cursed ground, and dismissed the practical warnings embedded in that framework. The failure wasn't in the indigenous knowledge systems. The failure was in the cultural barriers that prevented European settlers from accessing knowledge that existed and was being offered, just in forms they couldn't or wouldn't understand. This pattern repeated throughout the American frontier. Settlers died from drinking toxic water after ignoring Native American warnings. They died from eating poisonous plants that indigenous peoples knew to avoid. They died from traveling through dangerous terrain during dangerous seasons, despite being warned against it. The cost of cultural arrogance was measured in individual lives. By 1840, Black Canyon Creek had returned to its natural state, known only to Native American hunters who continued following traditional practices for working in dangerous terrain. The beaver population recovered quickly, without trapping pressure. The drainage remained as dangerous as ever, but now the dangers went unencountered because the people who might have fallen victim to them had learned, through 3 tragic deaths, to stay away. In 1842, geologist Samuel Prescott conducted the first systematic geological survey of western Wyoming territory, including detailed study of Black Canyon Creek. Prescott had read Whitman's letters about the drainage and wanted to investigate the geology more thoroughly. His work, published in 1844, provided comprehensive documentation of the creek's unusual features and confirmed many of Whitman's observations. Prescott mapped 73 separate solution pipes along the creek's 43-mile length. He demonstrated that many of these shafts were connected by underground passages, creating a complex network of subterranean water flow that extended far beyond what surface features suggested. He documented chambers beneath the creek bed large enough to hold several men, connected by passages that could transport bodies significant distances during flood conditions. Most significantly, Prescott documented several flash flood events during his study and observed how water moved through both surface and underground systems simultaneously. He measured water erupting from solution pipes with sufficient force to knock over a large dog that got too close. He documented water levels rising 23 feet in 14 minutes during one particularly violent storm, then watched as the surface water receded while underground flooding continued for 8 more hours. Prescott also made a disturbing discovery. The solution pipes were still growing. The process of water dissolving limestone was ongoing, meaning new shafts were forming while existing ones were expanding. Black Canyon Creek was becoming progressively more dangerous over time, not less. The creek bed that looked solid one year might be dangerously unstable the next. His work provided the scientific foundation for understanding Black Canyon Creek's hazards in detail that went far beyond Whitman's initial investigation. But Prescott's research had limited practical impact, because by the time his findings were published in 1844, the fur trade was already in decline. Beaver populations had been trapped out in many regions, and silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying the market for pelts. Trappers were leaving the mountains, either moving to Oregon and California or returning to settlements in the east. Black Canyon Creek faded from active concern as the men who'd known about the deaths died or scattered. The location remained dangerous, but fewer people were exposed to those dangers because fewer people were working in remote mountain drainages. There is one documented death on Black Canyon Creek after Morrison. A prospector named Henry Talbot drowned there in 1863 during the Pikes Peak gold rush. Talbot had been panning for gold along the creek when he apparently fell into a solution pipe. His body was found 2 miles downstream in shallow water, with no signs of injury beyond drowning. The circumstances were remarkably similar to the trapper deaths 26 years earlier, suggesting the hazards were still present and still lethal. Modern geological and hydrological studies have confirmed that Black Canyon Creek's dangers remain essentially unchanged. Solution pipes continue to form as water dissolves limestone. Flash flood potential remains high during storm events. Hydrogen sulfide releases continue from volcanic rock formations, though modern air quality monitoring would detect dangerous concentrations before they became immediately life-threatening. The creek is now protected as part of a wilderness area, with public access limited and warning signs posted about flash flood danger and unstable ground. But there's no historical marker explaining what happened there no indication that this drainage has a particularly dark history. The broader lesson from Black Canyon Creek extends beyond one specific dangerous location. It's about how knowledge systems work, how information is transmitted across cultural boundaries, and what happens when those transmissions fail. Native American groups recognized Black Canyon Creek's dangers and encoded that knowledge in oral traditions, emphasizing caution and respect. European trappers, lacking that accumulated knowledge and often dismissing indigenous warnings, learned about the dangers through fatal experience. The deaths weren't inevitable. They were preventable if the trappers had been willing to listen to people who'd lived with the land for centuries. This pattern repeated throughout the American frontier, with costs measured in lives. Settlers died from hazards that indigenous peoples had learned to recognize and avoid. They died because knowledge existed, but cultural barriers prevented effective transmission. They died because arrogance and prejudice made them dismiss information that could have saved them. Thomas Hendricks, William Cord, and Jacob Morrison paid for their knowledge with their lives. They died because they lacked information that was available, but not in forms they could access or trust. Their deaths weren't random tragedies of frontier life. They were systematic failures of knowledge transmission across cultural boundaries. The creek remembers in its own way. The solution pipes are still there, hidden beneath sand and gravel that look like solid ground. The underground passages still connect in patterns that defy surface geography. The volcanic rock still releases its deadly gases during certain weather conditions. All the hazards that killed 3 experienced trappers in 1836 and 1837 remain present, still dangerous, still capable of killing anyone who encounters them without understanding what they're facing. The difference is that now we have scientific explanations for each hazard, documented in peer-reviewed papers and geology textbooks. We have warning signs and access restrictions and emergency protocols. We have the accumulated knowledge of indigenous peoples and frontier trappers and modern scientists, all preserved in various forms. But we've lost something important in that preservation. The Shoshone who warned trappers away from Black Canyon Creek didn't need to consult geological surveys or read historical accounts. They knew through cultural transmission and embodied practice that the place was dangerous. That kind of knowledge, immediate, culturally embedded, transmitted through stories and practices, is harder to preserve than scientific data, but often more effective at actually keeping people safe. The 3 deaths on Black Canyon Creek stand as reminders that knowledge systems matter, that cultural barriers can be fatal, and that nature doesn't care whether we understand its dangers scientifically or spiritually. It only cares whether we respect those dangers and act accordingly. Black Canyon Creek killed 3 men because European trappers thought they understood the wilderness better than the people who'd lived with it for millennia. The creek is still there, still dangerous, still waiting. The question is whether we've learned anything from those deaths, or whether we'll keep making the same mistake, dismissing knowledge we don't understand, learning through fatal experience, and forgetting the human cost of our certainty. The answer lies in how we approach indigenous knowledge today, whether we're willing to recognize that different cultural frameworks can encode genuine understanding, and whether we're humble enough to learn from people whose knowledge doesn't fit our academic models. Thomas Hendricks, William Cord, and Jacob Morrison can't answer these questions, but their deaths, unexplained and inexplicable until science finally caught up to what indigenous peoples had known all along, should make us think carefully about the costs of dismissing knowledge that doesn't come in forms we're comfortable with. The creek flows on, cold and clear, over rocks that hide depths we still don't fully understand. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring the Old West archives with us.